Um, so first of all, I will introduce me and Isa, since we are the new hosts of the Sociolinguistic Lunch Series this semester. I'm a second-year PhD student in the linguistics program, and Isa is a second-year PhD student in the anthropology program. So we now run sociolinguistic lunches, taking over from the wonderful Kelsey. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Kahdeidra Monét Martin received her PhD in urban education at the Graduate Center in June of 2021. Her dissertation is entitled Counter Stories of Black High School Students and Graduates of NYC Independent Schools, a Narrative Case Study. To support her research, Dr. Martin was awarded a doctoral student research grant from the PhD program in urban education, a travel award from Division K of the American Education Research Association, and a Dean K. Harrison Dissertation Fellowship. Her research foci primarily orbit around adolescent literacy, the spectrum of urban education, social justice pedagogies, sociolinguistics, intersectionality theory, racial literacy, discourse analysis, and qualitative inquiry. In recognition of her commitment to pedagogical excellence, she was one of 3 graduate student recipients of the 2020 Teaching Award from the Graduate Center. And currently, Dr. Martin serves as a postdoctoral scholar of education at the Stanford Graduate School, where she completed federal work study as an undergraduate student under the mentorship of Dr. Ann Hartford Charity Headley. In addition, she serves as an inaugural scholar in residence at the Chapman School, her alma mater. And I apologize if I pronounced the name of that school incorrectly. So without further ado, please take it away, Kahdeidra.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Aiden and Yiza. Thank you for the warm introduction and for working with me and inviting me to participate. It's so great to be back home virtually. I'm here on the West Coast, and it's such a great opportunity to be able to to commune with you all. So hello, and we're going to get started. I have a lot of things to share with you, so I'm going to share my screen. And yes. Okay. Okay, so the title of this talk is Translanguage and Consciousness and Intersectionality and the Languaging of Black Students in Elite New York City Independent Schools. And of course, this was based on my recent dissertation research. So just a note, I'm going to start off with a note about my positionality. I will be, as an overview, I will be discussing the key findings of my dissertation. I'll take you through my methods, the theories that I used, and then I really want to hone in on the aspects of the dissertation and my research questions that address languaging in particular. So I'll give you an overview of the dissertation and some of my research in the context of independent schools, and then I'll do a deeper dive into the aspects that I thought were the most interesting about languaging, in particular dealing with translanguaging. And then what I'll do is I'll conclude with what my thoughts are and some issues for further inquiry that I'm led to think about, particularly considering belonging and a model of what I'm calling a relational student identity model that I was inspired to think about after my findings. Okay, so that's what we'll end with, kind of like more pedagogical oriented questions. All right, so we'll move through. I am a transdisciplinary scholar, so we'll move through some ideas and topics in sociocultural linguistics, but also kind of thinking about issues of pedagogy and in English language arts and in language teaching in general. So a note about my positionality. In much academic literature, Black people in the United States are depicted monolithically as Black American or Caribbean or African. for example, with each group having discrete cultural and languaging practices. One is either an immigrant or not, bilingual or not, yet my identity has been shaped by complex perspectives of migration, immigration, and belonging. And I found that this was also the case of many of my participants, of all of my participants rather. So my linguistic communities of practice were multilingual, and our shared repertoire included words of various origins. I regularly assembled words and phrases from American English, Caribbean Englishes, Haitian Creole, and Spanish to express my emotions. Okay, so I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, New York in particular, right? And I attended schools throughout Manhattan. So I attended schools from daycare through 12th grade in New York City. I was born in Savannah, Georgia. So my experience provides a counter narrative to the deficit paradigm afforded to impoverished families and to Black and Latino families in particular. In a working class immigrant African-American home with Georgia roots, I developed an exceptional capacity for language, resulting in high scores on the reading portion of standardized exams throughout grade school. I consistently scored above the 90th percentile in New York City statewide exams, the independent school entrance exam, and more recently, the verbal reasoning section of the graduate record examination. Right? So why is this important? It's important because, well, this is how our society is structured, right? That these normative measures of languaging are important. So this is why I kind of spell that out for you. But yet, despite my performance on these exams, on these normative measures, they still did not fully capture the full range of my linguistic awareness and heteroglossic competence, the abilities that fall outside of normative perceptions of because they are viewed as truncated or incomplete. So for example, discourses of achievement gap and language gap are driven by conceptions of discrete autonomous enumerated languages that only privilege the language practices of some students while erasing or stigmatizing the practices of others. So we have scholars like John Baugh, Ophelia Garcia, and Otegi who've written about this. So in contrast to deficit narratives, my lived experience with linguistic variation and having the freedom to creatively engage with diverse texts fostered high levels of literacy and language awareness. Okay, and so another big part of so clearly I'm someone who's very much involved in language. I identify as being a writer as well. I write creatively. I've written bilingual children's books. I've always really been interested in language, right? I'm also a graduate of independent schools. So you'll see on the left there in that picture, that's a picture of me and my middle school English teacher in 2020 when I came back for a reunion. Okay, and then I'm also from Grace Church School. I'm also a graduate of the Chapin School, which is a girls' school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So I'm very much embedded in this work. I myself, was a Black graduate of New York City independent schools, and I'm now an engaged alumna of these schools. So why was I interested in the study? Well, the inspiration for this study was that in 2019 was actually the 20-year anniversary of my high school reunion. And so during that same year, I was thinking about reflecting on, my experiences, having graduated from high school, what I'd done since then. I'd consistently been engaged with the school, but I was, this was a monumental year, a milestone year. And during the same time, right, the independent schools in New York City were in the news a lot, right? And independent schools all over the country were in the news because of student activism that was happening, right? So it kind of kicked off in February of 2019 with stories out of Ethical Culture Philston School in the Bronx, where there was a video that surfaced of students using what they describe as racist, homophobic, and misogynistic language, right, in videos. And students, they resisted it. So you had a multicultural, you'll see that picture there in the middle of Philston students, where you had a multicultural, multiracial coalition of students from middle school through high school who took over school buildings, okay? They took over school buildings, they held sit-ins, they talked to the press. It was a very concerted, very organized effort that they made to share what had been happening and to make it clear that this video that surfaced was not anomalous, that this was actually a part of the school culture, right? It was a problematic part of the school culture and also throughout independent schools, right? That they wanted to address and that they were fed up with, right? So around the same time in January, actually, so this one came actually the video in Poly Prep at a school in Brooklyn surfaced prior to that, right, in January. And so it was a blackface video, right, of some young girls it was a face mask that they'd had on, right, but they were making monkey sounds. Right. And then afterwards, the girls and their parents reported that they didn't understand the significance of it, that they didn't mean anything racist by it. Right. And that they didn't understand why people were upset. Right. So there was a discourse of that they were just unaware, that they didn't mean it, and that people are kind of, that they're blowing things out of proportion. Right. But again, during the Martin Luther King Jr. Day assembly at the school that the Black Student Affinity Group led, they also held a sit-in afterwards. And they say today, we're not going to have a moment of silence because we've been silent for too long. That was initially going to be the title of my dissertation, right? And I changed it, but it was initially going to be silent for too long, right? Based on the words of these student groups. And so they said, we're not going to kind of perform multiculturalism anymore and perform diversity, when in actuality, you have students who went through this school, who are in high school, who have no idea of why what they did was offensive. Right? They didn't have any consciousness of the history of blackface video and of caricatures of African Americans. So that's problematic, right? So whether they intended to be hurtful or not, the fact that they didn't have the racial literacy is a problem. All right. So these students activists really inspired me. Right. And so that inspired me to do this case study. Right. What I ended up doing was a relational narrative case study. Right. So, an overview of it is that I use purposeful sampling. Actually, sorry, I should have done my slides a little bit differently, so bear with me. But I'll give you an overview, and then I'm going to go into kind of, actually, let me define the terms that you see in front of you first, and then that'll take care of it. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear me using different terms. I use the term BAD, Black, which is an acronym, Black African Descendant. I use it as an umbrella term to indicate the racialized experience of any person of visible African descent who resides in the United States. So this term applies to anyone who identifies as Black American, African American, or any other ethnicized labels from throughout the Black Atlantic and Pan-African diaspora. So for this study, participants self-identified as Black in order to be eligible to participate. They offer their own definitions of Black American, African American, and other pan-ethnic identifiers that I include in the narratives. So to be clear, the terms Black American and African American, they meant different things across the participants. So if I only have that term as a label, then that wouldn't have allowed them to it wouldn't have allowed me to understand the complexity of how the participants identified. So this is why I had to come up with a different term, because some participants identified with being Black American and some of them didn't. Okay. I also use BAD ironically. Yes, I do realize I spelled out bad. I did that purposely, but I use it as a semantic inversion of bad meaning good in African American language, right? So by using the terms bad people and bad languages throughout my study, I hope to disrupt anti-Black discourses and inspire readers to query their own biases. So the term New York City Independent Schools, you may see it as NYCIS, NYCIS. And these are schools that are geographically located within the 5 boroughs of New York City. So for the study, NYCIS were delimited to day schools that were accredited members of the New York State Association of Independent Schools. And then I use the term alumni, okay? So this term that you see here is pronounced alumni. I realize there's a popular term alum that is used to be gender inclusive. However, to me, it seems reductive to me. I did take Latin in school. So, that's also a part of my positionality is that I took Latin. And so I learned how nouns were declined in Latin. So based on my perspective and my own consciousness of that, to me, the term alum is gender, it reduces gender, it removes gender completely. So I prefer to use the term alumni because it's inclusive of masculine, feminine, and plural gender identities. Okay, so what are independent schools, right? Independent schools It's a type of private schools governed by an independent board of trustees, right? So they are private schools. They're nonprofit, they're self-governing entities. And so whereas many, whereas a diocesan public school, for example, a Catholic school, it may be governed by, by a diocese or some other religious body. Independent schools, typically they're self-governing, right? And also what distinguishes independent schools from most other public schools is that they have a central academic purpose geared towards preparation for four-year colleges, right? And typically they're secular. So even if they have roots, in the Protestant traditions, like Episcopalian, right, for example, or Catholic, most of them are more secular in spirit, right? And they include students from a range of religious, racial, diverse backgrounds, right? So Powell, 1996, he, according to Powell, his characteristics of independent school was that there was a focus on community, right? There was a focus on standards, on exceptionality and some sort. So high standards for academics, for athletics. Students who attended these schools, were expected to excel, right? That was the culture. It was a culture of excellence. And then also personalization, right? So students also had the opportunity to enjoy a highly personalized academic program where teachers were looking for their genius, right? There's an assumption of genius. There's an assumption of exceptionality. And so students had the opportunity, to create clubs. They had the resources, right? They had the wherewithal, they had the encouragement, but they also had the economic resources to create a new club or to create a new affinity group, right? Or to ask for a particular type of class, in the arts and sports, if they demonstrated an interest in it, right? So this aspect of personalization and then having the resources, right, to be able to influence the program to a great extent, that's a feature of independent schools. Okay, and then Gastambide Fernandez, right, years later in 2009, who did a study of boarding schools, not boarding schools, but they were independent it was a day and boarding school in New England, came up with the 5 E's of what he called the 5 E's of elite schooling, right? And so, and then those 5 E's, excuse me, I need to, okay, my screen is being blocked a little bit. Okay, yes, all right. So the 5 E's of elite schooling, right, were exclusion, right? Found that these are exclusive environments. And primarily they started out being schools for the social elite, right? That's the foundation of independent schools. It was not, the concept of being academically elite came much later, right? But initially when some of the oldest schools in the country are independent schools, right? That started in the 1600s, right? When the Dutch actually controlled New York City. So one of the old, it's touted as being the oldest school, in the country. It's contested, that history is contested, but the collegiate school, which is a boys' school located in New York City, is touted as being the oldest school, regarded as being the oldest independent school and also one of the oldest schools in the country, right? And that was developed in the 1600s. So they were initially, right, a school, that was built on exclusion, on engagement, right, on students being engaged, not just academically, but the expectation is that students would be highly engaged in the social life of the school. So before and after school, in sports and arts, right? That they would be highly engaged, that their parents would be engaged in the school, being engaged in raising money, and participating in book fairs, lots of activities, to be engaged with the whole family. And again, we have excellence, right? Along with that came a sense of entitlement as well, right? And then also envisioning, where students were, always encouraged, again, to envision themselves as leaders, to envision themselves in the future, as being leaders of their communities, as being leaders in whatever field, career field that they went into. So again, a lot of talk about in programming to support students imagining a bright future for themselves, right? So again, they started out being socially elite, and then over time they became known for being academically elite. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about diversity in independent school prep programs. So when we talk, again, we said that, the school started out being schools for the socially elite. So they were for the wealthy, right? They were for the most privileged families in society, who were the first people to actually be able to afford schools, right? So before we had a system of free public schools, right, there were private schools, and these private schools were primarily for boys, right, for young men who were from elite families, right? And so that started shifting when but remember that they had a college prep mission. So when the criteria for colleges changed, right, the criteria for admissions to independent schools had to change as well. Right. And then that led to economic diversity. Right. So Powell states that economic diversity was attempted from the 1940s until the mid 1960s as a method to create a more diverse student body economically in order to create a more homogeneous student body academically. Right. So what that means was that they were willing to, by arguing that having more students who excelled academically benefited all students, as better students raised academic expectations as well as schools' reputations, they could more easily ask full-paying families to subsidize the education of scholarship holders if the result was to improve the school as a whole, right? So in short, what does that mean? This means that schools starting in the 1940s, that they were scouting and actively recruiting poor, and again, it was mostly boys, right, at this time, but boys, mostly from low-income families, and they were white boys, right, from low-income families who were excelling academically. Right. So they still kept the same kind of racial homogeny in the school, right? But they also, but the economic, it became more economically heterogeneous. Now, what this also did was this was the beginning of a two-tiered system. Right, it was the beginning of this kind of two-tiered admissions system that developed in independent schools, where although they were on scholarship, right? These students were on scholarship, right? But it wasn't explicitly clear, right, that it was an academic scholarship, right? But you had these students who were there on scholarship, low-income students who were expected to perform well academically, right, to justify their place at the school, whereas students who were from wealthier families who could afford to pay full price, there was no, yes, the standards there were still rigorous, but there was no expectation that they had to meet them at all times in order to secure their spot. So the beginning, right, of this kind of two-tiered, class system of admissions, right, started in the 1940s, and then post-1963, when we had pushes for the schools to become more diverse racially, and specifically, right, with the civil rights movement, with them including more Black students in their schools, right, then that's when that class tier also became racialized as well. Right. So in 1963, after the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, private philanthropy and federal government officials, they offered financial support to schools, right, to support the desegregation of independent schools. So there was actual federal money, right, that was set aside and that was geared towards independent schools, not directly, but indirectly through nonprofit access programs like A Better Chance, like the Oliver program, okay, for example. All right. So, however, from the beginning, Black scholars and parents, they critiqued the mission of what I'm calling these PSPs, these prep school prep program, right? Private school prep program, whose programming, it perpetuated ideologies of inferiority and white saviorism. So, for example, as Speed Franklin writes, with the exception of the Black Student Fund in DC, most programs identified, screened, placed, and tracked the progress of minority students who were classified as gifted and talented. So these students were screened for being gifted. These are Black students who were being screened for being gifted, right? The academic records of these students notwithstanding, many programs required these youngsters to participate in remediation programs in preparation for independent school matriculation. So in effect, intensive remediation of gifted and talented minority students implied that even the best minority student was somehow inadequate to compete in the independent school setting, right? End quotation. So this kind of dynamic, right, of screening Black students for being gifted and being academically exceptional, you screen the students for that, but then when they enter the school space, you're still bombarding them with deficit narratives, right? So this kind of disconnect and this discord is something, this dynamic is something that we see that continue to play out, and it's something that I saw surface in my data as well. Okay, so a little bit about Black students in independent school. This is an overview. Prior studies have shown that racism and classism continue to negatively impact the socialization of middle and working class bad students. Right, we have studies from Datnow and Cooper, Jaquir Gumby, from Epps, Horvath and Antonio, and Speed Franklin, right? And at the same time, generally for independent schools in general, there's studies have shown by Coleman Hoffer, Kane, Kahn, and Powell have shown that leadership, that for all students, that leadership, having open dialogue with their teachers and having close relationships with teachers was a feature of independent schools, right? And I have to say that most of these studies that were done were on boarding schools. All right, and I think that, you know, there's actually less literature. Most of the research, prior research that was done in independent schools focused on boarding schools. They were ethnographies of boarding schools, right? So where my research differs is that there's a specific focus, well, for one, on locality in New York City, but it's a specific focus on day schools, okay? And it's a case study. So that's going to give us, you know, a little bit, a different kind of insight, right? Because I argue that there are fundamental differences between socialization in a boarding school and socialization in a day school. So, and that's something that hasn't yet been teased out as much in the literature. Okay. Prior research has also found that racism and classism continue to negatively impact the socialization of middle and lower income Black students. And then more recently, Anthony Jack's study of, let's see. Okay, Anthony Jack's study, right, he studied low-income students, the experiences of low-income students at an elite university, right? And so he identified there being two groups: those students who were from under-resourced schools prior to coming to this elite private university. He referred to them as the doubly disadvantaged. And then he refers to the other group of students who had already attended elite independent schools, whether they were day schools or boarding schools, as the privileged poor. So while these students were poor and they were low income, they also came, right, with a certain amount of training and privilege and social cachet that allowed them to socialize and to assimilate and to kind of adapt better to the expectations of elite schooling at the university level. Right, so it's this group that Anthony calls that Jack calls the privileged poor that I'm highlighting in my study. Right, these are Black students, and they were predominantly from low income. In fact, all of my participants were from middle to lower income families, and they're precisely this group of students who Jack, you know, who his research tracks once they enter private schools. Okay, so based on, you know, that overview of the research, I developed the following 4 research questions. 1, what kinds of multimodal and linguistic resources do bad high school youth and alumni of New York City independent schools use to express their identities as members of various communities? How do ideologies of language, race, class, and gender impact perceived schooling experiences of bad high school youth and alumni? What challenges and supports do bad high school youth and alumni encounter in New York City independent schools? 3, according to bad alumni, what are the lasting impacts of their New York City independent school experiences on their present day lives? And 4, how do multimodal public narratives of bad alumni describe ideologies of language, race, class, and gender? So based on those questions, I developed. I'm sorry. I realize that my slides are a little bit. So bear with me. There's a lot. I realize, you know, for one thing, that it may be a little bit blurry. This is I'll try to just go through my theories a little bit quickly, right? So I'm going to talk a lot, but you'll have this one slide here to reference the theories that I work with. So the 3 theories that guide my inquiry are translanguaging, critical race theory, and intersectionality, right? So the first one, overarching theory for me that's really important, is translanguaging. So rather than reifying dominant narratives of incompleteness, brokenness or bad, right, quote unquote bad, translanguaging reconceptualizes the fluid dynamic languaging practices that bilingual people use as an extension of their linguistic repertoires. So to quote Otegi et al. 2015, translanguaging is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages. Okay, framed in dynamic systems theory, it aligns with scholarship on discursive identity construction, right? Garcia and Lee Wei, 2014, posit that translanguaging is, quote, a creative process that is the property of the agent's way of acting and interactions rather than belonging to the language system itself, right? So it's the people that drive, and not just the people, but the interactional awareness and the dynamic interactions of people amongst themselves that guide that guides translanguaging. So based on these varying definitions of translanguaging theory, there are 4 nodes that emerge as integral to conceptualizing translanguaging as method for me. And so these nodes are, one, having an integrated linguistic repertoire, having dynamic and flexible languaging practices, the internal perspective versus outside categorization, right? So translanguaging is something that happens from an internal perspective that I'm going to talk more about, and why this was really central to how I'm really inspired by translanguaging. And then also having a shared practice of translanguaging being a shared practice of multilingual people amongst themselves, right? So the whole phenomena of translanguaging, right, is dependent on context. It has to be contextualized, right? It's not just something that one would do spontaneously, with any group, but it's highly dependent on having a shared repertoire. Okay, so as again, in designing my study, I was thinking about, how could I create, conditions and the conversational context so that my participants would feel a sense of kinship with me, that they would know that we would possibly have a shared semiotic linguistic repertoire, also, like having a shared experience of being Black students who attended independent schools. All of these things contributed to how freely they spoke with me about languaging, and then in how they spoke with me about languaging, whether or not they translanguage and to what degree, right? So the interviewer mattered. My positionality and my relationality to my participants was highly important, right? And it was a determining factor on the outcome, of my study. Okay, so I propose that, that translanguaging as a form of linguistic style indexes transnational consciousness. Right? A sociolinguistic style, of course, can be thought of from Eckert and Irvine as a set of resources that hold specific meanings within and across social contexts. Right? So, and that the internal perspective of translanguages, like I said, is that of integration. Critical race theory is something, that I also use. Critical race theory, it sought to bridge the divide between critical theory and lived experiences, exploring the possibilities and historical limitations of the law to improve the material reality of people of color. Right? So several theories have emerged since its initial founding in the 1980s, but there are 4 central tenets of critical race theory that comprise the foundation of subsequent scholarship, and that I also found throughout my study. So one is that racism, is a social construction, right? It's not something that was fixed, but that ideas of race have shifted over time, and that's also been reflected in the law. And then also racism is ordinary, right? It's not aberrational, it's normal and ordinary. That racism is a salient part, right, of the United States history and identity. It has been. 3 is that race intersects with other identities, so the concept of intersectionality, which I'm going to talk more about. And then counter stories, and then also that counter stories can challenge dominant narrative. So because there have been dominant narratives and incomplete and inaccurate narratives perpetuated throughout time, throughout the history of this country, particularly about African Americans, that it's important to have counter storytelling and counter narratives from first person experience, right, to in order to give a more complete and accurate, picture. Right, so that's why that was important, because frankly, in a nutshell, research has been harmful, in that, certainly, academic research has perpetuated these harmful and inaccurate narratives because they were rooted in racist theories. So we have to have the lived experience and the perspective of participants in order to counter that. Okay, and then of course intersectionality, by Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, is focused on the idea of the intersections. Primarily, it was with race and gender, right? So the idea of having multiple marginalized identities. Initially, it was specifically focused on the experiences of Black women, right, who were marginalized both racially and then also marginalized because of their gender identity. And then it's since become extended. So some overlapping themes of critical race theory, translanguaging, and intersectionality, right, is the idea of having like multiple consciousness, right? So this is where I'm going with the concept of translanguaging consciousness, is that because I believe that translanguaging reflects and expresses and it's reflective of a transnational consciousness, right? That it's important that we keep that into consideration. And then also discursive identity construction, that translanguaging, is a form of discursive identity construction, and that intersectionality and critical race theory play a part in that and how it's constructed, right? The fact that race is socially constructed, but not even that, but how gender is socially constructed as well, right? And then also that linguistic ideologies, that they co-construct ideologies of race, gender, and class. Right. And these are things that, some scholars that I've mentioned before and others have done more work on, but these are the overlapping themes that have guided my study and how they intersect. Okay, so now the case study design, right? So it was a qualitative case study, right? Where themes were co-constructed. So again, I am a research instrument. The themes of reciprocity, co-construction, and reflexivity were highly important. I used purposeful sampling to, random, I'm just gonna read from this so that I can be succinct. So in this relational narrative case study, I used purposeful sampling to identify 6 total participants for in-depth interviews. And I employed document analysis of 4 fiction and nonfiction narratives. In summary, I collected and analyzed 4 written narratives, 6 interview transcripts, and 2 visual collages as data sources. My central theories of translanguage and critical race theory and intersectionality guided all aspects of study design. And I engage in what's called critical race methodology, which is crystallized in explicitly exploring counterstory as narrative. And so from this, I build on the work of Berry and Cook in 2019, Kim, Martinez, and Miller et al. Okay. And centering the role of intersectionality. So this study contributes to research on bad students in independent schools by examining ethnic heterogeneity, narratives of racism, classism, and sexism, and complex languaging practices. It offers narratives of bad students across boundaries of socioeconomic class, ethnicity, and gender expression, disaggregating data in the bad student population. So in addition, it offers an exploratory analysis of the languaging practices of youth in independent schools that's delimited to New York City independent schools. So just to go back here, it was a case study that integrated public narrative. So I used different sources. I triangulated my data source in order to build my case. So you'll see on the 4 ends of this relational model highlighted in blue public narratives. These consisted of middle grades graphic novel, one was a memoir by Daniel Padilla, and then the 2 other ones were articles, like a long form article, and one was a blog post. So these were public narratives of graduates and they were all Black males, graduates of New York City independent schools. And then in the center there, we have 6 participants who I interviewed directly. And these, for in-depth interviews, the interviews range from 90 minutes to 3 hours and 15 minutes in one case. Right. And then there were 2 high school students, current students, whom I interviewed. And I also analyzed I had them create visual collages that I'm sorry, I don't have time to go into now in this particular study, but they are in my dissertation, visual collages that also reflected their identities. And in the middle there, you'll see there was actually a 7th participant. Right. So again, because of it was a relational narrative case study, and the importance of relationality really emerged, that there was a story that was circulating by several participants. Several of the participants told me the story that they had heard or that they knew of a student, we're going to call her Venus, right, who was a bad alumna who was actually pushed out of a New York City independent school. Right. And so what I did was I created a composite character, right, called Zami. Zami means friend, right? Zami means friend in many Francophone languages in the Caribbean. It means friend. So that's the composite character. And they told the story, Venus is also a synonym of their friend Venus and what happened to her. So while they were telling me their own narratives, they also were carrying, that was on their heart, the story of what had happened to their friend who they felt was treated unfairly, right, because of race and because of class and because of gender. They all, not all of them, but many of them, told me of this story. So I had to include it in the case context, in the case study. And I did so by creating a composite character. That's how I accounted for that data. Okay, so here's, I kept a reflexivity journal throughout. And then I also color coded transcripts and coded them. Okay, and so now let's kind of, go into some of this analysis here. Okay, so for one of the students, Danielle Peralta, this was one of the public narratives that I analyzed, which is a memoir, right? And so thinking about like the themes of fragmentation and intersectionality, he writes in the opening of his memoir. It's really poignant. It helps us to set the stage because he explains how he compartmentalized these two aspects of his life as a teenager, stating, quote, "I was 17. In my teenage negotiation of the divide between hood life and school life, I was carefully managing which aspects of myself I present to the people around me," end quote. Over time, he experiences a shift in consciousness, quote, "But I would rather run after the impossible than live with the string of labels, undocumented, hood rat, Dominican, classicist. I am all of those things. No one or two of them define me," okay, end quote. So for me, this was just a really beautiful and eloquent and succinct display of translanguaging and translanguaging consciousness, right? Because as opposed to thinking of himself in multiples and into fragmented selves, it was the intersectionality of these labels, but also it was integrated. So his consciousness shifted over time from thinking that he had to hide parts of himself in his schooling in order to fit in, to accepting the full range of who he was related to class and languaging and ethnic identity and gender identity. And he's now an award-winning, and storied professor of classics at Princeton, right? So these are things that he learned to integrate over time, right? So intersectionality theory upholds that his marginalized identities could not be parsed. And Peralta's experiences of race, gender, and class during his years at collegiate were informed by the simultaneous interplay of his identities at any given time, right? So how intersectionality played out in his life it also kind of surfaced in a similar way in some of my other participants. Okay, so now I'm going to focus more on translanguaging. Give me 1 second, because I did go out of order a little bit in order to try to be more succinct. Right, okay, so let's focus on one participant. We're going to go deep in depth into two participants. One is Isatu, one is True. So the first one, right, there are themes of transnational and transcultural languaging, as I call them. So Isatu, and you're going to learn more about her, right? So Isatu was born and raised in the neighborhood of Harlem in Manhattan, New York. She's a recent alumna. She uses she, her pronouns, and she's a recent alumna of New York City Independent Schools. Both of her parents were born in Senegal and immigrated to the United States before she was born. Okay, she grew up in the neighborhood invariably known as Little Africa or Little Senegal in Harlem. And she states that she spoke Wolof at home and that, quote, "most of my family is French." Taken together, Isatu reports that she spoke some combination of Wolof and French at home, yet the boundaries of these languages were unclear. When asked which subject she excelled at in school, Isatu replied, quote, "I was really good at, yeah, I was not that good in French," which is surprising given my whole family's French. "I would make up words that weren't real and say them in like a French accent and like hope to get away with it," end quote. She recalls being surprised by her lack of proficiency in the French language, despite her family being, quote, French, which seems to mean being from a Francophone background. These feelings imply that Isatu had received validation from home and her community about her proficiency in French, but she received a disparaging assessment of her French languaging skills at Highland, which is the name of the independent school that she attended in the Bronx. in New York. When she states that she would, quote, be making up words that weren't real, quote, in class, one wonders where this assessment of made up words originates. It is possible that Aisatu's perception of words being made up derived from her encountering racial-linguistic ideologies at school that illegitimated the languaging of her home and her home and community. And so, of course, you know, I'm here referencing the work of Jonathan Rosa, excuse me, of Jonathan Rosa, oh my God, they're going to kill me because I adore them both. But it's just, so, you know, charge it to my head because I quote them all the time. But Rosa and Flores, right? And Nelson Flores, right? Forgive me. Nelson is also a graduate of the program. It's just, I have a bad short-term memory, right? So I'm quoting their seminal work on sociolinguistics, and certainly sociolinguistics ideologies did emerge, you know, throughout her transcript and several of the others. So Aisatu uses African-American language when speaking about bad friends who use the language and in reference to herself. When I asked her if she had ever experienced or witnessed discrimination at school, she cites several instances, including one involving her friend Marsha, who was a bad female. She states, and this is the quotation that you see on the board, you can read, that you see on the slide. And then, yeah, William Tate specifically, an individual in class called Marsha the N-word casually. He was like, oh yeah, my N-word. And then she was like, Marsha's from the Bronx, and she's like, so she just did not have it. And then, like, you know, raise it up and was like, this kid called me an N-word, did what I had to do. So in recalling the memory of a white male student calling her bad female friend the N-word, Aisatu recounts the narrative in part using phonological and lexical features of African-American language, perhaps a regional variety, right? She did not have it, quote, she did not have it, quote, raise it up, quote, did what I had to do, and New York City speech, right? And some phonological features of New York City speech. Another context in which Aisatu used African-American language another context in which Aisatu uses African-American language and marked New York City variants is in response to the question, are there any negative consequences to your life now based on your experiences at school? In the following excerpt, she uses African-American language in a narrative that explores themes of racialized and gendered notions of desirability and having negative self-worth and self-esteem. Quote, I still never thought I was worth anyone's time. I happened to be in a relationship junior year and senior year with someone outside of Highland. So the attention that I was getting, I wasn't aware of it at all. I wasn't told this until years later when everyone was like, oh, Aisatu, like, Will talked about you, da-da-da. I'm like, I didn't know that. So at the time, I'm experiencing this space where it's like, I didn't know I was literally attractive at all, like at any instance until 11th grade. So of course that, you know, clouds you. And so I went to Jones, which is the private college that she attended. It was ranked by U.S. News World and Report as being in the top 10 private colleges in the country. That's where she attended after Highland. And so I went to Jones like, I'm that bitch, you know, I run this world. Because I didn't have any, it was inaudible, but I didn't have any chance to do that in high school where that was my moment to like shine. So a lot of like having to learn what self-worth looks like. Is it through yourself? Is it through others? Is it through partners? So figuring it out now, but 100% because of Highland that I haven't figured it out. And she was laughing as she said that. So when it came to feeling desirable or pursuing romantic relationships, Aisatu reveals that she was unaware of any sexual intention from white males at Highland in particular, and she discusses not knowing that she was attractive. Her socialization at Highland had, quote, clouded her self-esteem and self-concept. She acknowledges that she remains in the process of learning what self-worth is, and she attributes this process, quote, 100% because of Highland that I haven't figured it out, with the laughter functioning as an emphatic marker rather than as an expression of humor. Okay, so that's something that she did throughout the interview. But also note that Aisatu uses the filler phrases da-da-da, right, da-da-da-da-da, or variations of it 5 times in total throughout the interview. I noted that, right? So she uses it 5 times. So, and I thought that was significant. So I did some research, and according to Baby Girl 209, from 2016 on the Urban Dictionary website, it is da-da-da-da-da is a saying used when filling in the blanks. So based on my own positionality as an African-American who was raised in New York City and who has some training in sociolinguistics, I have observed that the usage of the phrase appears to be common in New York City speech, but I haven't necessarily heard it in other regional varieties that I'm familiar with. Like, for example, I'm in the Low Country where my family is from, in South Carolina and Georgia. I haven't heard it there. And I also haven't heard it yet, among speakers here, in the Northern California area. Okay, so it's something that I intuitively think may be something that's a more salient feature of New York City speech, but more research needs to be done. So furthermore, the frequency of usage is higher among bad youth, I observed, from quote uptown. These neighborhoods inclusive of Harlem in the Bronx, and Harlem in Manhattan, and in the Bronx. So this meaning of uptown itself indexes an insider's long-term perspective of New York City neighborhoods that is illustrated in a daily cost posting by the commenter Brooklyn Bad Boy. Okay, so let's see, what Brooklyn Bad Boy has to say. He says, you can't say, quote, I live uptown unless you live in Harlem or the Bronx. This will confuse us natives. If you live on East 86th Street, you live in the city, not uptown. Harlem is not the city. Harlem is Harlem. Yes, it is in Manhattan, but it is most certainly not the city. However, if you live in Harlem, the city is not the city. It is downtown. Harlem is a distinct place and a distinct destination. If you live in the city, Harlem is not part of the city. It is Harlem. It is also uptown as in a destination as well as a direction. Okay, so did you catch all of that? Was it confusing to you? Right? So throughout, this is an insider's knowledge, right? This is the hyperlocal literacy of understanding what is uptown geographically, what it also indexes ethnically, right, and racially and culturally, what that means. So throughout the interview, IC2 draws from a diverse linguistic repertoire that includes registers that some scholars of language might classify as academic, formal, and informal. In addition to indices of New York City speech, IC2 uses African-American language in the rhetorical style of braggadocio and hyperbole. First, she uses the semantic inversion of disempowered to empowered sense of the word bitch, right? Like to declare it as I'm that bitch and I run this world, are phrases that have been popularized by Black American artists like Missy Elliott, Beyonce, and Rihanna. And Geneva Smitherman in 1977 and again in 2000, notes that, right? The semantic inversion, right, of disempowered to empowered in the word bitch. She notes it there. Right. So also IC2's languaging practices are in line with what Smith 2019 observations that people of Senegalese descent in New York City tended to have higher frequencies of code switching, stating, quote, several people remarked that speaking English allowed people to diminish immigrant stigma or stake a claim on, quote, American Blackness. At the same time, they also extolled multilingualism, particularly in the multicultural enclave of Little Senegal, where Wolof and French could be heard as often as English, end quote. So although we solely use words and phrases that are part of the English language lexicon, there were instances where IC2 explicitly articulated herself using African-American language. And in particular, perhaps we can think of, we tend to think about regional variants, but my study participants are really encouraged us to think about variants according to borough, right, within New York City, right, with perhaps being one of those things, okay? So now I want us to turn to another participant named True, okay? And for True, there's a phenomenon of translanguaging and transvariant priming that I found to be that surfaced, right, in their pronouns are they and them, so in their work, in their interview. So from the start of my interview with True, ideologies of gender and language in general and a translanguaging theoretical orientation were prevalent. After I asked for their pronouns and preferred name, they explained that they had recently adopted the name True. Quote, there's a nickname that one of my friends gave me. Talent radiates universal energy. I've been doing that recently, quote. So again, these are all pseudonyms that I'm using. IC2 is a pseudonym. True is also a pseudonym. So keep this in mind that True did have a name that was similar. I'm very proud of myself, again, as a creative writer, that I came up with this pseudonym that fully captured, that better captured the pseudonym that True had. But True does actually go by a name that is an acronym that means something really deep. It's just not True. Okay, so just, this is the meaning that I came up with, for it. So based on the acronym. So talent radiates universal energy. I've been doing that recently. Okay, I talked a lot there, right? So it is noteworthy that True conceptualizes their name as an action rather than a fixed appellation, right? So don't miss that. This act corresponds with critical linguistic theories that envision language as a process rather than an object of study, in line with the critical post-structural ontological shift from nouns to verbs, right? So when True says, yeah, my name is True, I've been doing that recently, right? So don't miss that shift. They're not just saying that this is what my name is, right? This is saying that this is what I'm doing, which means that I can undo it as well, right? That there's a fluidity there. Just as one can do, one can undo. There's the verb there. There's an action there, right? So I credit our recently transitioned Queen Mother of American Letters, Toni Morrison, who famously stated in her 1993 Nobel Prize lecture that, quote, "We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives," end quote. So in explicating the significance of renaming, True explicates the temporality of names. They state, quote, "I feel like True is very like in the future when I'm in a specific state, but Sophia is very like grounded in the past. And I'm okay with that, This fluidity of naming parallels with an integrated sense of past in Sophia, future in True, and a present that is conscious of both. Quote, "I don't mind either way. I'm okay with that, Rather than having a discrete name for the present, her present self is demarcated by the flexible use of both names. When we started the interview, I noticed that True initially had another name listed on their video screen, and we discussed this afterwards. So quote, "I love it. I love it. I love it because it's like, it's not what you think, right? Like you don't think that it's an acronym." And I was going to ask you about it. I was like, "True?" You was like, "Who this?" "True? Yeah, laughing. "Why would you name yourself True?" "Oh, okay, I love it. I love it, yeah." And what pronouns do you use? They, them, she, her, both of them. True's response of "you" was like, "Who this?" is the first instance of their use of an utterance that had a high concentration of variation beyond mainstream American English, and that included features of African American language. So one, the regularized use of "was" with the second person singular versus the mainstream American prescription of "were," right? When she said "you" was like, "Who this?" The quotative, the use of the quotative "like," which may be attributed to my use, in the preceding line, right? When I said "I was like," that may have primed them to say "you was like" too, right? And then 3, the use of zero copula in "who this," right? Compared to mainstream American English, "who is this?" or variants of Southern American Englishes even that may include "who is this?" or "who it is," right? So there's that zero copula there that is, a key feature of African American language. There's also the use of the voice alveolar stop, D, in place of theta in the realization of this as this, okay, which we both used. So first, I voiced my curiosity and mild confusion at seeing the name True in the Zoom waiting room, right? Because I have a relationship, with True, and I didn't know that they were going by a different name. Right. So I was like, "Who is this in my Zoom? Are they trying to Zoom bomb me and ruin my study?" And then I found out that it was them. Right. Next, I provided a sentence stem by stating, quote, "I was like," accompanied by a quizzical facial gesture. True then predicted my feelings and interpreted my facial gesture in their response. Because they elaborated on my utterance, they conducted a discursive move of revoicing that affirmed that what I had been feeling. In their use of African American language, they affirmed our shared racialized identity and perspectives. Additionally, their fluid use of personal pronouns increased throughout the interview as comfort levels increased. Towards the end of the conversation, after the interview guide was completed and we were freely talking about issues related to the study, the following exchange occurs about hairstyling, starting with my decision to cut off my hair during college. So I start with saying, I cut it short. I cut it myself. And then I went to Ghana, and then the trip to Ghana, I decided after I came back, I said, I'm not gonna comb my hair anymore. So I stopped combing my hair. laughing, right? I was laughing and I grew and it grew locks. I was a natty and then we both were laughing. I was a natty dread and I had that for like 3 years and I cut those off. And then I just, was getting twists and keeping it natural braids. So yes, but I've been natural for a while. But yeah, I may do my locks again. We're going to see. Then True says, we're going to listen, the fluidity. That's all that matters. You just got to keep it moving. Yeah, whatever it makes, whatever you feel in your spirit, that's what it is. Then True responds, yeah, so we're trying to grow them. We're going to see what happens. I'm excited. I've never done anything like this before, I shaved my head like I've had this much hair for 2 years. So I'm finally letting it grow out again. And it's exciting. Yeah. So first, True fluidly uses first-person plural pronouns to affirm the importance of fluidity in hairstyle choices. And their commentary also reinforces a broader theme of fluidity as necessary for survival. Okay, so second, they use both first-person singular and plural pronouns to describe their decision to grow dreadlocks. Whereas True's and my sharing an overlapping linguistic repertoire and matching linguistic ideologies fostered and reinforced a sense of fictive kinship throughout the interview, having different linguistic repertoires and ideologies about language engendered conflicts among her teachers and peers. So the exchange that you were able to see here is, again, it's because we had a shared linguistic repertoire. And it's because, my positionality overlapped with, right, and enhanced their positionality. So that's why this exchange was able to happen. If that weren't the case, right, then perhaps things would not have transpired the way that they did, right? So when asked what subjects they were good at in school, they pinpointed Spanish, history, and art. Their motivation for wanting to build fluency in Spanish was driven by their sense of cultural kinship with African descended Spanish speakers. Okay. So True responds, they respond, no, I think I was good at Spanish. I was really good at Spanish. I think I was good at Spanish, especially because, which now I know that there actually are a lot more direct ties, but my apartment building that my dad owned, our tenants were all Honduran and they'd always speak to us in Spanish. And I was like, I really want to learn Spanish so that they could talk, so that we could talk, and like, I later learned that like Vincentians, like migra, or the you know what I'm talking about? Why did I just forget the name of the people? So then I responded, Garifuna. And Chu said, Garifuna, yeah. I recently learned that they were in Honduras. And I was like, that's a clear connection that we didn't even know at the time. And I was like, why do I feel so connected? And yeah, so I wanted to learn Spanish because of that. So I started taking Spanish in 3rd grade and continued on. It was good. And I think I was a great Spanish speaker. I think it was more so based on like testing and stuff where I didn't receive some of these awards, but it's okay. Awards aren't everything, whatever. So their motivation to learn the language was directly related to desiring to connect with other African descendant people and nurture the ethnic cultural ties that they felt with the community of Spanish speakers. True's experience correlates with those of African American women in Brazil learning Portuguese and other African Americans in world language education that Uzo Anya in 2020 that she writes about. Okay, so we need more research done on the experience of African Americans taking language classes and what motivates them, right? What kinds of pedagogy, encourage and motivate them to learn languages. And we'll find that much of it comes from this cultural kinship that they find with their with communities with speakers, right? So later in the interview, True discusses the experience of speaking Spanish to help families at food banks, at a food bank being a watershed moment. Okay. Yes. So later in the interview, True discusses the experience of speaking Spanish to help families at a food bank being a watershed moment that gave her language learning purpose. right? So for example, Chu says, and one of my friends who would also, I've known her since I was 4. She had been taking Spanish with me. She started speaking to them in Spanish because it was easier for them to process, obviously. And so I just started speaking to them in Spanish too, to try to figure out like, how can I best help you? Because other people didn't know Spanish. So I was like, let's just try this out, try to help this community however way that we can. And so I think after being a bit more calm, like having more conversations with people, I was just like, okay, I feel more comfortable. I feel like the goal is not the testing or anything, it's how well they can understand me. And the Spanish speakers that I knew said that I had a really good accent, which I don't know what that means, but they were just like, you speak it well, like you don't sound chopped or anything. And I know for a fact that these other kids like sounded chopped up and sounded like, you know, like I feel like they just couldn't get the way that everything rolled off of your mouth differently. Like I was able to understand different things. And I feel like the people in my building, but also my parents and the way that they speak, I'm just used to like people speaking different ways. So I feel like it's easier for my ear to pick up on it than others. But I feel like people didn't care about it. So I just let my confidence, you know, do whatever it was doing. So Chu cites having Vincentian Creole as part of their home language repertoire being a primer to learning other languages. Scholars define linguistic competence as the system of linguistic knowledge held by speakers of home language. By speakers of a home language. They also use the term linguistic dexterity to describe the flexible and skillful use of language. Yet when describing the linguistic consciousness and literacy of racialized languaging practices that differ from political grammars of named languages, I'm using the term transvariant priming. In parallel to translanguaging, I define transvariance, you know, as a dynamic language use process that multi-dialectal speakers of the same named language employ to negotiate meaning and expressions of identity. So I know this may upset, you know, many of my people in the translanguaging camp that I'm happily a member of, you know, by using variation and dialect. But I do think that in order that it gets at a different kind of concept, right? So this concept of being primed for linguistic variation and linguistic variation within a named language. I don't think that, you know, just kind of considering, you know, variation within a named language, you know, and just calling everything a language, that doesn't quite get at it. It doesn't quite get at these insights. So that's why I'm offering the term transvariance and transvariant priming. But please, if you can think of a different, you know, another name or something, you know, that's kind of more eloquent and that captures it, then I'd love to talk to you more about that. But that's why I thought that it needed a different term, right? So that's why I'm calling it that. So transvariant priming explains why Chu was assessed as having a, quote, good accent by Spanish speakers that they knew from Honduras and from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. So I argue that Honduran, Puerto Rican, and Dominican Spanish, that they share, right, linguistic features and variation that are similar to African-American language and Vincentian Creole, that prime speakers of these languages to more readily notice and adapt the phonological and syntactic nuances within these languages and others, right? So it was her competence, that the multilingual competence that she grew up with. And specifically, I'm calling it the transvariant priming, you know, that Chu developed. Sorry, I misgendered them, you know, the transvariant priming that they developed, right? That allowed them to be, quote, a good speaker, to sound like, quote, a good speaker of Spanish and to notice that variation. Okay, so I wanted to talk, I noticed I'm running low on time. So just quickly, you know, how does this all relate to kind of belonging, right? So basically belonging is feeling included, accepted, respected. So when we think back now to what can schools do, belonging is a sense of feeling personally accepted, respected, included, and supported, right? It's feeling close to a part of happy at school, feeling that teachers care about students and treat them fairly. It's when students get along with teachers and other students and feel safe at school, right? Belonging is important because it's a critical source of student motivation and engagement. It's also grounded in connections between young people's identities and their schooling experiences. So the narratives that students shared about belonging and the messages, particularly, you know, that I focused on here, but messages, you know, racial linguistic ideologies and messages about dominant languaging and what were appropriate, right, and inappropriate languages to use, all of this affected their sense of belonging, right, and their identities in schools. So we have to, you know, think more, we really need to do more to address student sense of belonging. In particular, I noted, just to kind of to wrap up, that there was a silencing of Black girls, right, throughout. That was a common theme throughout the narratives, throughout both the public narratives and also in my participant interviews. So in particular, like there was a novel, award-winning novel, it's a great novel, graphic novel, New Kid by Jerry Craft. However, when Black girls are rendered in the illustrations of the text, they never speak. And in fact, throughout the novel, which has 249 pages, bad girls on Riverdale Academy's campus appear in just 7 illustrations and 6 pages. And again, they never speak, right? So consistent with the scholarship on the experiences of Black girls in independent schools and on the voices of the bad woman graduates in my study, bad girls are marginalized and silenced in even fictionalized narratives of New York City independent schools. Okay, so I'm going to skip over, I had, these are just coded for belonging here, but I want to, kind of to sum up. So one of my key takeaways of the study, was the importance of translanguaging and utility of it as, of translanguaging theory. Again, it's really influenced my thinking about consciousness, about my own consciousness and my transnational consciousness. And then also the importance of thinking about transvariance, right? And and how it relates to racialization and anti-Blackness and how it addresses that. So it reorients the languaging of bad people as skillful, right? And informed by a multilingual context. So when we have, these students that exhibit these resources, these linguistic resources, that are racialized, and we need to honor them, right? And provide more opportunities for them to express it and to excel. And then translanguaging consciousness is what I'm defining as it's a dynamic process of assembling and reassembling aspects of identity according to perceived social patterns. So for example, if you look at the bottom of this illustration here, this is kind of like a visual that one could think of one's linguistic repertoire. So there may be aspects of that linguistic repertoire that one could assemble according to one's racial identity, right? But then we could also assemble things according to one's ethnic identity, one's pan-ethnic identity, for example, being Caribbean, or African in general, right? And then one's national identity. And so I'm really interested, in the concept of linguistic repertoire and of assembly and reassembling and the dynamism involved in that. And that's something that I saw that was illustrated, that my participants illustrated a lot. Okay, and then also the importance of the relational narrative case study design. My relationship to the case study community was important. It informed my design. It also, it was important for me to be able to interpret the results that I had as well. And also that, it reinforced the idea that our social identities are relational, right? That they're co-constructed in relation to each other, and that individuals use agency to embrace or reject social identities. So this is a relational student identity model that I developed in thinking about the students' relationships with each other, with their school, that maybe one can think about, when we're trying to reach student and differentiate instruction and have culturally relevant discussion and pedagogy, it's really important to think about how they are connected. Discourses of race, discourses of ethnicity, right? Discourses of going to a private school versus a public school that are impacting that student sense of identity and how they interact with each other. So that's something that, we have to think about an integrated model and how the student relates to students in the school and then into cohorts outside of the school, that we need to consider that when we're planning, culturally responsive and culturally sustaining instruction. Okay, so this is just how it will look from one of my participants, Jonathan, who attended a boys' school, Lewiston. He's Ghanaian American. He's also a Black African descendant. He's attending a boys' school in the Upper Manhattan, voice of the co-ed school in another borough. He was also a member of a private school prep program. He's first generation. So all of these things are going to dictate and influence, right, his sense of belonging at Lewiston. Okay. Some thematic codes that generated from my interview data were the importance of relationships with peers, relationships with teachers, that there was rigorous academics, sometimes stressful. And then, school culture, people had ambivalent feelings about it. That it was important that they frequently experienced microaggressions, but that they also, found some kind of comfort in participating in arts and in affinity programs. The expression of sexuality, was suppressed, right? Black girls are being hypersexualized, were excluded from the dating culture at the same time. But also many, girls and non-binary, youth reported, experiencing sexual violence in the form of harassment or even assault. Okay, so in summary, Black students experience psychological, emotional, and physical harm from ideologies of language, race, class, and gender. They experience or witness discrimination related to gender or sexuality. And on the whole, bad youth and alumni benefited most from positive relationships with staff and faculty members, culturally relevant and multicultural curricula, affinity groups and informal socializing with bad peers, and then participation in sports and arts programming. Okay, so some of my guiding questions for further inquiry are, what are the hyperlocal and emic perspectives of race, ethnicity, gender, and class among youth in different locales? What are the ideologies of race, ethnicity, gender, and class in specific neighborhoods and city contexts? How can knowledge of these ideologies inform culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy and support belonging for racialized youth in elite secondary schools? And then also, how can we proactively use the relational student identity model to support belonging among all students, not just racialized students? So in conclusion, it is my hope that this research will add to the narrative of bad youth and literacy in the United States by illuminating the agentive, subversive, and necessary place of bad talk in, quote, good schools. May the narratives of bad youth in New York City independent schools provide a wide angle for seeing and grasping the fullness of the urban student experience, further problematizing notions of privilege, and further eroding borders of race, language, and class. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful talk, Dr. Martin. Let's give Dr. Martin a very big round of applause. Now we will take questions. So you can raise your hand using the raise hand function, or you can put your question in the chat, and Isa will be monitoring the chat. But yes, the floor is open to questions. Yeah, Cece.
Hi, Kahdeidra. So great to see you, and hope you're well out at Stanford. That's wonderful. Congratulations on your post. It's just great to see you and hear from you. And I guess what I was thinking was a very practical question. So if someone were to ask you whether to send their bad child to an independent school, how would you advise them? And if you were asked to advise or consult on, with the staff or leadership of an independent school, what would you tell them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cece, for this question. I also want to, just highlight that Dr. Cutler was on my dissertation committee. So thank you very much. And she's excellent. I love her. So I would say that, for the one hand, so the first question, which I believe was, the second question was like, how would I advise? Oh, I know. The first question was, if people weren't to send their bad, students to New York City independent schools, or just an independent school in general. My advice, my response would be, it depends. I mean, there is variation among the schools, right? But it depends on what the family's goals are, right? And if I think that they need to be more informed. So I would say understand what you're signing up for. Right? On the one hand, these schools have enormous resources, right? They have lots of material resources, but they are schools that are predominantly comprised of, of students from wealthier backgrounds, from upper middle class and wealthy backgrounds, right? So if you are a family from a low income background, you need to consider that context. Right? And you need to consider these are also schools that may not necessarily have a lot of support for students with learning disabilities, right? And who need additional types of differentiation, right? Some of them do, some of them don't. So I would say that it's, and in general, most of them are predominantly white. So they're predominantly white, predominantly wealthy schools. And I would say that if you are considering placing your child in these schools, you need to be active. You need to ensure that you're going to be prepared to be an engaged, active member of that community, to be an advocate for your child and for other students. Because again, that's the expectation, is that parents do have a lot of agency. So if you push for things, but you have to push. So it's a different kind of model from like a public school model, in that, in many low income neighborhoods, unfortunately, where, where parents aren't accustomed to having a lot of voice, right? But in this culture, these are kind of like the hidden curriculum of it is that you have power, but people may not tell you that. So you are expected to push, but they won't tell you. If you push, you can get what you want. But that's something that families who've been conditioned, in these environments, that they kind of know that more so than others, right? So that's advice that I would give, and ensure that you have supports outside of the school for your child. That's something I wish that I had had. Right? You have to have something to balance it out. So knowing that you may not get certain things in this context, make sure that, your child is involved in extracurricular activities that will support, their racialized or ethnicized identities, and cultural programs that will support them, so that you're not solely dependent on the school context. And I find that, even for other students, right, from my own lived experience, and from, it wasn't didn't come up as a part of this study, but, many of my Jewish friends who attended these schools, they really benefited, particularly, they benefited from attending Hebrew school. Right? That was something that helped to reinforce their sense of cultural and religious identity. And so I think that, students from racialized backgrounds, right, ethnic backgrounds, need to think about that kind of model as well. And then also, kind of, what advice, what I give schools in thinking about it, right, is that, schools, many schools, and I am working with schools now, like I am working with Chapin, I'm a scholar in residence there for the second year. And then I recently, I joined the curriculum committee of the Board of Trustees from Grace Church School, right? So I am still engaged in both schools that I graduated with to try to influence curriculum, right? And so, my message and what I'm trying to do is to provide kind of research-based models of cultural, kind of moving beyond, anti-racist curricula that where we're not quite sure where it came from, right? We're not quite sure where these models came from, but aligning it more closely to models, like Gloria Ladson Billings, right? Culturally relevant, culturally, Paris and Aline, culturally sustaining pedagogy, Donna Ford's model of gifted multicultural education. So really just kind of trying to provide these models that I think most people don't know about. So as a scholar, I can do that. Thank you for your question. Mm-hmm.
Next, we have Renee Blake.
Hi there. This was a wonderful talk, very deep and thoughtful and interdisciplinary, and thank you so much for that. I guess my question is, so I'm coming from New York and from a Long Island case where I grew up with busing of Black boys into white independent schools. Predominantly white independent schools. And so my question is this idea of crossing boundaries and belonging. And so a couple of things. So my brother went to a private school, I went to a public school, and there are ways that he found his way into our public spaces, and I found my way into his independent school spaces, right? So I feel like there's something else there that I want to see as well. And then the second thing is, as quickly as you could belong is as quickly as you can unbelong, depending on within a moment, right? So you can have a teacher who is in an independent space, is loving, kind, thoughtful, and says, don't do this because it makes white people feel uncomfortable. So it's so multi-layered as well. So I also want to just bring that to the forefront. But this idea of, it's not only about these students bad students going to independent schools, but what it means then to keep one foot there and one foot in all the other spaces that they're in.
So yeah, thank you for that, for kind of servicing these issues. And I would say, you're absolutely right. Being in the public spaces, excuse me, and in these private school spaces, that kind of transit identity, is something that really, featured a lot, not in the narratives that that I shared, but there was one participant who talked about, just what it meant to travel on the train in her uniform skirt, how the symbolism of that uniform skirt meant something different. And it actually made her a target of sexual harassment. right? And then also the particular school that she went to was a girls' school that was known for, the pseudonym for the school is Chamberlain, right? And so there was, there's a discourse, right? The sexist discourse about, schools, students who attended that school kind of being easy, to get in bed. So she was ashamed, right? So, she it went from kind of general sexual harassment when she wore her uniform skirt, from on the subways, from, in her Brooklyn neighborhood, her Flatbush, Brooklyn neighborhood to the Upper East Side, to then, that skirt indexing more specifically that I am a part of this school community. So it's this outsider's perspective, but it was within the independent school community. So only people within the independent school community could then, identify, right, to decode her as being a part of this group. And so that's something that, that came up kind of as she moved in and out of these public and, public and private school spaces that was really relevant, to your point. And then there was another participant, True, actually, where True talked about, True lived in Bed-Stuy. She grew up in Bed-Stuy. They grew up in Bed-Stuy. So, they grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. I'm using acronyms because I'm from, I'm using shorthand because I'm from Brooklyn, but there's a neighborhood in the borough of Brooklyn in the city of New York City called Bedford-Stuyvesant, which was predominantly African-American, right? But there were also, she was from St. Vincent, from a Caribbean family, right? She had a different experience kind of with languaging and belonging in that space where she was maybe perhaps exposed more to African-American language, right? And she talked about that and how people in her neighborhood and her own brother who attended a public school, their own brother who attended a public school told them, don't speak Av because you don't sound right. You don't sound right speaking it, right? So there was that kind of alienation in that neighborhood. But then also there was, contrast this to another student who grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, where I grew up in. And that was a predominantly Caribbean neighborhood, right? She's Jamaican and Caribbean. So her, what reinforced her languaging in her community, it was reinforced because she was Jamaican, and there's a lot of Jamaican and other people from the Caribbean there. So in terms of like belonging, then she definitely felt like she belonged, right? And she talks about that in her narrative, that this was, everything, she felt very comfortable in her neighborhood in terms of culture because her neighbors, they spoke the same, you could smell like the same food cooking, they played the same music, particularly during the summers. And so it really affirmed her sense of Jamaican and Caribbean identity, whereas True's experience may have been a little bit more different. So yeah, so that's definitely something, like in terms of space and who controls space that I want to think more about. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Sarah?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask if there was, if the students themselves kind of engage in any kind of meta-linguistic commentary on their translanguaging, and if so, I mean, I'm imagining they did. If so, kind of what some of the more important or more interesting patterns that you noticed in that might have been, if you would just speak to that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think True is just so fascinating. True did much of that, right? And so True was also a writer. So they talked about how they would, more so in their writing, so in translingual writing, right? And they talked about how they, actually a sense of, it was conflict. So it actually created some conflict for them because they knew. So for example, in college, they're a poet and they knew, right, that there was a particular discourse that was affirmed in college, and that if they wanted to be, to win different awards for poetry, or if they wanted their work to kind of have a broader audience, they knew they were, and they talked about like how they knew that they were, they had this fluency in this kind of dominant discourse. However, they also wanted their they wanted their poetry to appeal, to Black people, specifically to a Black audience. So for example, they'll quote them as saying that I want my work to sound like, I want to sound like Jericho Brown, right? That was their model that they said. But then that was a racialized, right? So this was kind of like, in terms of their racial and national identity as being African-American, they were inspired by the poetry of Jericho Brown. However, they also talked about when they wrote their poetry in Vincentian Creole, right? That they really, the sweetness of having people who weren't into people in their family, older people who were in their family, and people in their community who weren't necessarily into poetry, but that they could relate to what they were saying, and it affirmed them, it affirmed their culture and their identity in a deep way. Right, but it was a more niche community. So True actually, talks about that, and I write about that more in my dissertation, where they talk about, writing for different purposes, right? And not necessarily kind of like translingual writing. I think that they're still trying to figure that out. They're trying to figure out who would be the audience for this, right? But more like talking, more like writing in different different languages separately, but also, kind of, I think they're still working on that integration as a writer. They also talked about, True also talked about a lot about the fact that they attended the schools. They talked about colorism, the fact that they were lighter skinned and that they benefited from light skin privilege. They were lighter than some of their other bad friends at the school, and that they recognized they benefited from that, but also that they had attended the school from kindergarten. So when their friends came later on, that they had predominantly white friends, right, who thought that they knew who they were. Right. And so then when they made Black friends who came in middle school and in 9th grade, that their white friends then overheard them translanguaging and thought that they were assuming an identity that was not true. Right. And they said, well, wait, like this is who I am. Isn't that funny? They told me, why are you hanging out with this person? She's being a quote bad influence on you. So they told them that some of their new friends that they met were being a bad influence. You don't even sound the same. You don't sound like yourself. You don't sound like yourself, Sophia, right? And so there's this, really interesting point, which, she reflects on that, saying that, well, actually, they thought that they knew me, but all this time they didn't. I always spoke this way. Right. It's just that the context didn't present itself. She didn't speak, she didn't speak an African-American language with them, with her white friends, but she did. The context presented itself for them to be able to do so with their new friends. Right. So that's something that she did, that they did reflect on. I'm using so I choose preferred pronoun is they, but they use both. And this is a participant who I have had a year, I've been knowing them for many years since they were little. And so it's, I'm still kind of learning that shift, it's new for me, but I try to keep, the day, but yeah, so True, again, amazing person who's very reflective and kind of illustrated a lot of kind of the most metalinguistic awareness, I would say, about their languaging than any of the other participants. So I just kind of shared a snip of it, but really fascinating overall. Like, they really are like they're really skilled linguists and writer. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
So maybe we can have one last question. Yes, Wafa.
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for this wonderful speech. I really enjoyed it. My question is just straightforward, and it's about your definition of a small, tiny detail that came in your model, and that's pan-ethnic category. How do you define that category, please? Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. So, so the concept of pan-ethnicity, and I'll use an example, right, is that we have, for instance, and the example I'm thinking of is from my participants. Many of my participants, come from Caribbean cultures, right? So they may have a specific Jamaican American identity, right, within the United States, or a Guyanese American identity, or a Haitian American identity that's specifically, connected to their parents, and then some to their parents' nation where they're from, nation state. However, they also have this pan-ethnic identity of being Caribbean. So in this particular, so that's one example of a Caribbean pan-ethnic identity. So that where ethnicity, I'm kind of using ethnicity here, ethnicity being analogous to nationality. Okay, to keep it simply. So ethnicity being analogous, to a concept of nation, of nationality, right? So it can be a hyphenated, ethnic identity in the United States, like like I just gave an example of Jamaican American, or even Dominican American, right? But then you may have, people from the Dominican Republic who also very much identify with being Caribbean American. Right, so that's a pan-ethnic identity to them, with being from the Caribbean, although their specific nationality is Dominican, from being from the Dominican Republic. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Okay.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Martin. Let's give Dr. Martin another round of applause for a very, very wonderful talk. Yes, thank you everybody for coming. Once again, email us at sociolinguisticslunch@gmail.com if you want access to the recording. And we hope to see you all next month at Felipe de Jesus' talk. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming and supporting. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being here.
Hi, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kelsey. Hi.
Hi, sorry, yeah, I was on a hidden camera before because I'm in a car. But thank you for your great talk. And I was like trying to do the chat. I'm just a mess. But the talk was wonderful. I'll have questions for you later. But thank you. And thank you, Isa and Aiden, for organizing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for helping me talk through it initially.
Yeah, we'll keep talking.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Oh, I got through. I was so nervous. My God. So tell me, thank you both. I hope it. People are very generous. I just hope that it cohered. I was pulling together lots of things. So, I hope that the coherence was there. Was more than what I felt like it was. Yeah.
No, it was definitely very coherent. Yes, it does. I felt your talk did that thing you always want to do in social research. It felt like it was really like a story, not just like research, but also like the sense of life there in your research was really there. It really came through. Also, that the acronym you came up with TRUE, that was really that was very convincing.
Okay.
Yeah. That.
Thank you.
Yeah, really good. Really good acronym. Yeah, it definitely seems like the type of thing that would only come up like in spontaneous speech. Isa, I don't. Oh dear, I seem to have frozen.